I am American, but I know a little Russian. A few years ago, I was in St. Petersburg. I decided to take tickets for a motorboat to Peterhof. All the signs were in Russian, so I had no trouble understanding the prices. But it was obvious that I was not a local, and the saleswoman decided to play on that. She offered tickets 3 times more expensive. To which I replied directly in Russian, "But on the signboard it says that the ticket costs so much." Her reaction was ridiculous. In general, this is a typical story for Russia, where prices for locals are one thing and for tourists, another. We had a Chinese eatery near our campus. Everyone spoke Chinese, but I always spoke to them in English because I was embarrassed by my accent. I usually ordered rice and meat. One day I only went in for the meat, as the rice was already at home. I hear the cashier yelling in Chinese, "This is a fat horse. There will only be meat without rice." I decided to reply in Chinese to show I understood. From then on, I always get a refill, and they didn't even charge me for that order. I lived in South Korea for 3 years, but I hardly learnt Korean. But I met an American girl who was considered not local because of her American accent. The teachers didn't even think she knew Korean and were rude to her face. She put up with it for a year, until at graduation, when she remembered being called a foreign pig. One of the teachers just cried. I wish I'd been there to see it. When I worked at McDuck, I was surrounded by Spanish-speaking co-workers. They didn't realize I spoke Spanish. Sometimes they were rude to me in Spanish, but I pretended I didn't understand. One day a manager told me that he was more appreciated because he spoke 2 languages. I told him in Spanish that I knew 3. He just freaked out. One time on the bus, 2 Swiss women were discussing Latinos. One asked the other if her friend thought I was handsome. I couldn't take it anymore, and I turned round. Yeah, I was wondering the same thing. It was just funny to watch their reaction. And then there's this. I'm an American expat in Thailand with a big beard. The locals often don't realize I understand them. One day a couple of teenagers just pestered me with comments about a monkey. I stopped and looked at them. 2 young girls, about 14 years old, started yelling at me, running around, screaming, pissing me off like I'm a monkey. I decided to deal with them. I looked them straight in the eye and I said, "What, are you always so amused by commenting on the appearance of passers-by?" And seeing their startled faces added, "Maybe you should think about what words you choose when you say them to passers-by." And so, when I finished my speech, they suddenly froze, as if discouraged. Then I just walked away, leaving them alone. After thinking for a second, I added, "And remember, words can leave a mark not only on you, but also on those you offend." And without waiting for a reply, I continued on my way. While I was in Germany, an English teacher I knew invited me to her school for a lesson. She introduced me to the students and I said hello, telling them I was from the United States. My friend suggested that the students ask me questions in English. Then one guy at the desk decided to make a joke in German, thinking it would stay between them. He said something like, "Americans are stupid." The teacher blushed and the students laughed. To diffuse the situation, I said in German, "Yes, many Americans speak German." The guy was as shocked as a kid who accidentally got on stage during a concert. He really didn't expect me to understand German. One time my friends and I went to a shopping centre. While I was trying on clothes, 2 shop workers were standing next to me and discussing me in Spanish. They called me a dumb Greek, not realizing that I understood Spanish because of my Spanish roots. When I came out of the fitting room and answered them in Spanish, they just burnt with surprise and shame. My aunt and I were flying on holiday to a resort. She was in a wheelchair because of a broken leg. At the airport, a German couple said horrible things about her, not knowing that we both spoke German. My aunt politely replied to them, and the man blushed in shame. I lived in London and got into some funny situations. Once I accidentally bumped into a guy on the tube and we apologized in English. Then I enjoyed the situation for 5 minutes, while he told a friend in Spanish what a fat horse I was. When I got off, I told them in Spanish that their jokes were offensive. They were shocked. My stepmother looks like a white Italian woman but speaks Japanese. One day she went with her friends to a beauty parlor where Japanese people worked. They started making jokes about her, not knowing that she understood them. But my stepmother answered them in Japanese and they stopped talking, realizing that they were in an awkward situation. And here's another funny story. I'm walking down the street and 2 little Japanese girls shout that I'm hot and blue-eyed. My self-esteem skyrockets. But when I turn around, it turns out they meant the other one. One time, a friend and I took a taxi home after a drink. We didn't have much money, so we offered the other two women to share the taxi. They agreed. We're driving along, and suddenly they start speaking Swedish. I could understand Swedish, but I was so drunk I didn't care. Suddenly they refused to pay for the taxi. I offer to tell the driver, but they say, "Until these two ladies give me half, don't let them out." The driver took the hint, and they had to pay after all. In Korea, I was invited for a haircut, and the assistant hairdresser casually addressed the hairdresser, referring to me as that one. When I heard them talking in Korean, I joked that I didn't realize this salon only catered to princesses. They apologized and didn't make fun of me again. I also remember an incident when in Japan on the underground I was suddenly stopped and asked for an autograph, thinking that I was an American star. I was completely bewildered, but I signed anyway. I didn't want to offend them. By the way, once in Thailand I came across a group of tourists who thought I was an American and started talking to me in English. I decided to go for the joke and answered them in heavily accented English, pretending I didn't understand very well. They had fun and I watched their reactions. There are funny situations in ordinary life too. For example, when I was buying groceries in Japan, the cashier, seeing me, decided that I was ignorant of the local currency and started cheekily profiting from me. I replied to her in perfect Japanese that she was wrong, and she was shocked. Once when I was in Germany, I was only 22 but looked so young that a girl in the queue casually said I looked like a baby. I asked her what kind of baby I looked like, and she was very embarrassed. She instantly ran away. But eventually I realized that being able to understand Korean helped me connect with her, and we continued to communicate in Korean. When I lived in London, I had a funny situation on the tube. I was travelling home after work, and there was a huge crowd of fans on the tube going to a football match between Chelsea and Barcelona. At one point, the metro stopped abruptly, and I pushed one of the fans a bit. After apologising in English, I heard him start telling his friend in Spanish that he clearly thought I didn't understand. Something along the lines of, "That fat boy better not be hanging around." I turned to them and replied in Spanish, "Yeah, I think so too." Their reaction was just funny. They immediately froze as if in shock. And another incident from my life in Japan. One day I was walking down the street and I heard girls saying, "Oh, look how handsome he is, and with blue eyes." My self-esteem just skyrocketed at that moment. I turned around to look at them and found two little Japanese schoolgirls who were probably about 13 years old or even younger. Apparently, to them, I looked like an ordinary foreigner, and they didn't expect me to understand them. It was a pretty funny moment. When I worked in a shopping centre in the US, many customers preferred to discuss their purchases in Spanish, thinking that I, looking like a typical white American, didn't understand them. One day, when I brought an item to the checkout counter to pay, two women behind the cash register started joking about my choices in Spanish, calling me a bad customer, and so on. When I politely looked away and replied to them in Spanish that I'd already made my choice and didn't need their help, their faces instantly turned red with embarrassment. That moment was really funny, and I hope they don't make assumptions about their customers so easily anymore. Once, while on a tourist trip in another country, I overheard a couple actively discussing passers-by on the street. They assumed that none of them understood their language. However, as I walked past them, I responded to their comments in the same language. Their faces were truly frantic when they realized they had been exposed and became quiet. In one of the shops, I heard a couple discussing the products on the shelves. They were looking at the goods and criticizing their quality in their own language. When I approached to ask a question about a product, they were completely shocked when I addressed them in the same language. Their attempt to hide their displeasure was unsuccessful, and instead resulted in a ridiculous and clumsy apology. At the banquet, I overheard a conversation between two guests who assumed I didn't understand their language. They were discussing issues related to my work and sharing their observations on how I could improve my performance. And it was funny when I intervened in the conversation and started giving them advice based on their own recommendations.